Welcome again, everyone. This is Adam Lafacci, your moderator, rejoining you, and we're just about to kick off in the Face of Extinction, thinking about the biodiversity and conservation of frogs. And we're going to get started with a frog video and song that we wanted to share with you today. So we'll have that playing for you now.
Frogs are more important than you think. Come in every color from green to pink. Sure would be a shame if they were to go extinct. 'Cause frogs are more important than you think. If you woke up tomorrow and every frog was gone, it would affect the entire animal kingdom. There'd be no one to eat the bugs off the leaves. There'd be so many insects you couldn't breathe. They'd eat all the crops, and then where would we be? Frogs are more important than you think. Come in every color from green to pink. Sure would be a shame if they were to go extinct. 'Cause frogs are more important than you think. Now every animal's a link in a chain. From the big blue whale to the tiny garden snake. But some of these animals are almost gone, like the Panamanian golden frog. If we lose a link in the chain, it affects us all. Alright. Frogs are more important than you think. Come in every color from green to pink. Sure would be a shame if they were to go extinct. 'Cause frogs are more important than you think. That's right, frogs are more important than you think.
And we'll be talking with you a little bit more about why frogs may be more important than you think. And before we kick off the main content of our session today, I just want to cover a few technical aspects of the online room with everyone. First off, you may have noticed that on the registration page, there were also forms to introduce yourself. And if you haven't had a chance to, we do hope that you'll pop over there and type a quick greeting in either during or after the session. But now that the session has started, you're welcome to talk with us in the chat box on the left side of the screen throughout. And you'll notice that open chat in the lower left-hand corner, and you can feel free to enter your comments and questions in there throughout the entire session. If you do have any content-related questions, we will try to address some of them as we go along, but if you don't get an immediate response, don't worry, we do see it. We'll try to tackle them if we can. If you have any technical questions, though, you'll notice there's a little box above the open chat that says technical questions with a question mark. And you can type those in there, and I'll respond to you privately to get those sorted out as quickly as possible. If for any reason you get bumped out of the online room or you're not able to ask me for technical assistance, you can always email us at smithsonian@learningtimes.com, and our team will work with you to make sure you get signed into the room as quickly as possible. You may have also noticed that we have closed captioning down at the bottom of the screen. And if that's distracting to you, you'll see in the upper right-hand corner of that box, there's a little drop-down menu, and you can change from where it says WGBH to no captions. But a big welcome and thank you to WGBH for joining us today. We have a few other ways of engaging in the conversation and a few other resources to share with you, which we're highlighting here. First off, your conversation is not limited to the chat box. You're welcome to speak with us in the Twitterverse, and we're using hashtags frog and conservation today, so feel free to tweet with us there. Also, we have a great group of resources gathered together on Pinterest, and you'll notice that we have the hyperlink there on the screen. You can click on it now, and it will actually launch in your browser window, and you can feel free to look at that after the session and just have that available. Now you'll notice up top we're also highlighting Smithsonian Quests and shareable Smithsonian Education badges. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Ashley Naranjo here at the Smithsonian to talk a little bit more about the quest associated with today's session.
Thanks so much, Adam. I'm Ashley Naranjo, and I work at the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. And this online conference session is actually part of a larger experiential learning package for students. So in addition to getting to talk to our Smithsonian experts, you can also participate in our Smithsonian Quests program. And that's a digital badging program. And they're really calls to action and self-directed learning opportunities. And so for this session specifically, we've created a digital badge called the Frog Follower. And in this digital badge, we have 3 associated quests that go along with it. In the first quest, students are asked to listen to frog calls and then identify and distinguish them based on what they hear and using descriptive language to differentiate different frog calls. In the second quest, Warning Signs, we have a conservation biologist from the National Zoo who's created an interactive for students to be able to identify ecosystems that frogs live in. And frogs are actually known as an indicator species. So taking a look at the impacts of deforestation, for example, and as the song said, they are part of a larger ecosystem, and they're really able to show us exactly how the health of the ecosystem is affected. And finally, in Spot It, Brian and Sharon, as well as Angie, are all part of a larger citizen science project that they're asking students and pretty much anyone around the globe to become involved in. And so with the Global Amphibian BioBlitz, there's information on how you can help scientists basically find and count and identify each of the frogs that are still existing with us today. And so with each of these pieces, they kind of are scaffolded activities and are easy enough for students to really get started and kind of extend their learning past just this online conference. So we would love for you to join Smithsonian Quests. I also wanted to mention that there's a Smithsonian Channel documentary called Mission Critical Amphibian Rescue that's actually available for free on iTunes. So you can either click the link or check it out. It's also listed in our Pinterest page. But just another documentary. I believe it's a little under an hour, but another resource that you can show to your students as well. Also wanted to mention that this is part of a larger series. So every second Wednesday, we have a monthly online session that highlights the great work that's going on around the Smithsonian. And so we'll have an educator from the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum join us, and he'll be talking about ways to get students engaged in environmental stewardship and urban waterways. And then we also have a very special collaboration conference series coming up in November, and that will be actually a 3-part series with partners from around the DC area, the diplomatic reception rooms of the Department of State, the National Park Service, and American History curator will be joining us. So be sure to save the dates for all of those upcoming events.
All right, wonderful. And thank you, Ashley. We're now going to be turning to the presenters that we have joining us for today, and we're really excited to have Brian Gratwicke joining us here in Washington, D.C., and Sharon Ryan and Angie Estrada joining us from Panama today. So thank you so much for taking part in this session. We're excited to hear what you have to tell us about frogs and amphibians, and I know my knowledge is limited to just a few years of catching frogs as a kid, so hopefully we can go a little deeper today.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. My name is Brian Gratwicke. I am an amphibian conservation biologist at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. So it's my job to try and save frogs from going extinct. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about amphibians and some of the problems that they face. In total, there's about 7,000 different species of amphibians. Most of them are frogs, but you also get salamanders, which are the amphibians that have tails, as opposed to frogs that do not have tails, and the caecilians, which are the legless amphibians. You'll see that there's only 200 described species of caecilians. That's because they mostly live underground and they're very secretive. So probably not a lot of the caecilians that are out there have actually been described in science yet. In fact, we find that every year, 100 new species of amphibians are discovered. So our total number of known amphibian species is rising every year. When you compare that with the other vertebrate groups, there's about 8,000 kinds of reptiles, 10,000 birds, and 28,000 fishes. Amphibians come in all shapes and sizes, but this is the smallest known amphibian. It's called Peter Phryne, and it comes from Papua New Guinea. It doesn't have a common name yet. It was only described very recently, but that is an adult frog, and they can also get very large. What you see here is a giant Japanese salamander that can grow to 5 feet in length. But its cousin, the Chinese giant salamander, can actually grow to 6 feet in length, and it's the biggest known amphibian species.
And Brian, as we're taking a look at all of these people working with such fascinating creatures, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into the science of all of this?
Sure. I got into the science of amphibians because I was a conservation biologist. I have a background in working in fishes in Africa and the Caribbean, and also in tigers in Asia. And so one of the things that I work on as a conservation biologist is the threats that act on all species and ecosystems. And I found that there's very limited number of things we can actually do to mitigate those threats. And it doesn't matter what kind of group of animals you're working on. It's all basically the same kinds of problems and the same ways to solve them. So I see myself as less being an amphibian biologist and more of a conservation biologist. But amphibians really drew me in because they're under such incredible levels of threat. And for me, it was a very compelling conservation problem, but yet there were very few people actually working on solving it.
It sounds like you've been to a lot of different areas for that work. Where did you start originally?
I originally started out in Zimbabwe. I'm from Zimbabwe. And then I went and got my PhD in Oxford in the United Kingdom. But I was doing my field work in the British Virgin Islands. So it's been quite a career, and I've got to see a lot of different parts of the world, and I really like it because it, it gets you out into all of these wonderful habitats and experiencing very cool different kinds of wildlife.
And it looks like from this map that a lot of those habitats have at least a few amphibians present.
They do. So let me just describe to you what this map is showing. The bluer areas indicate that there's very few species, but the warmer red areas indicate that there's a lot of species. And so what it's doing is effectively showing you the hotspots for amphibian biodiversity in the world. And what you'll see is that amphibians are very diverse in tropical forests in Africa, in the Brazilian Amazon. And you'll also see up here in the Appalachian region, there's a nice little warm spot. And that's because of our incredible biodiversity of salamanders in this region. But amphibians do live in every type of biome. You'll see even here in the Namib Desert, there's amphibians, and in the desert regions of Australia, still have amphibians that can occupy every kind of habitat you can conceive, ranging from desert to rainforest to Appalachian streams. So they're a very diverse and adaptable group of animals. So a lot of people will say, well, why are frogs important? And I think this is a really fun poster that was developed by the Vancouver Aquarium to illustrate the concept of ecosystem services. Because frogs eat a lot of the pests that eat human crops and spread diseases. So their take here is if frogs go extinct, you'll notice, because there'll be a lot more invertebrate pests around because there won't be any frogs eating them. Frogs are also important to people because they're a source of food. Every year we eat between 1 and 3 billion frogs, and the international trade in frogs' legs is worth $40 million. So, you know, I think that frogs have a very direct value to people. But you can also talk about frogs in terms of option values. And what I mean by option values, what would happen if we lost this frog and we didn't have it anymore? So when we look at the biochemistry of frog skins, they have a lot of chemicals that could help us. For instance, this frog at the top here, the firebelly toad, has bradykinins in its skin that can help us to dilate our blood vessels, and it can be used as a treatment for high blood pressure. The White's tree frog from Australia has a kind of chemical in its skin called a serin that can block HIV transmission to other T cells. So it could be an antiretroviral. And all of these frogs, this is one of my favorites here, the phantasmal poison frog. It has a painkiller in its skin that's 200 times more powerful than morphine and non-addictive. But to illustrate the concept of option values, what happens if these frogs go extinct? Well, this frog up here is the gastric brooding frog from Australia, and it's called the gastric brooding frog because it literally swallows its eggs and raises its tadpoles in its stomach and then vomits the little babies out when they're fully developed. And unfortunately, this frog, both known species of this frog went extinct in the 1980s, and they were being used to research a cure for peptic ulcers, because in order to stop the frogs from digesting their tadpoles, they can secrete a prostaglandin that kind of inhibits gastric acid secretion. So unfortunately, along with that frog, we could have lost the secret to curing gastric ulcers.
Celine in New Jersey is curious, have these chemicals been synthesized in labs, or do we still need the original compounds from frogs?
That's a very good question, Celine. What I didn't mention in this slide is that these chemicals are extremely difficult to manufacture in labs because they're such complicated peptides. So these chemicals have not actually been taken through to full production. Like, you cannot go and buy epibatidine in a chemist today because we have not been able to synthesize it or produce it at a level that'll make the sort of biosafety standards. But what I was trying to communicate with that slide is the option of, hey, there are these potential cures out there that one day, once our technology becomes sophisticated enough to deal with those, if we've lost all of our frogs, we will be in a much worse off position. So you know, those aren't real options. They're option values for the future. And you know, in today's culture, we place a lot of value on appearances, and so you know, I think that just frogs are pretty darn good-looking animals, and I don't want to see them. I don't want to see them going extinct anytime soon. So I don't think you need to put a dollar value on everything in order to justify saving them. So what's the problem with amphibians? The Amphibian Crisis, in a nutshell, says that of the 7,000 described species of amphibians, that we have enough data to actually make a conservation status determination about, 43% of them are declining. And this is a much worse situation than for any other known group of vertebrates. Just 12% of birds are threatened or endangered, and 23% of mammals. We've lost probably about 122 species of frogs since 1980, and when you compare that to other groups, we've lost just 5 birds and no mammals, except perhaps the Yangtze River dolphin, over that time period. So we're not doing a very good job of preventing extinctions.
That's such a startlingly high percentage for amphibians. Why are they more susceptible than some of the other animals you've mentioned?
I think amphibians are a particularly vulnerable group for a lot of reasons. One of them is but just the word amphibian means two lives. So amphibians tend to have tadpoles that are usually aquatic, and those grow up into usually terrestrial forms. And so they occupy both water and land, and they can be very, very vulnerable and susceptible to any disturbances in either on land or water. So if you lose amphibians, so if you have an impact of pollution in a stream, it doesn't matter that it's running through a pristine rainforest, the amphibians will still disappear. And this is a slide of some of the extinct amphibians. All of these amphibians that you see here, just incredible diversity of colors and rainbows and habitats, have all disappeared. And this is the face of extinction. You know, it's very easy to say, oh, we've lost 122 species of frogs. But when you have a look at these different frogs, here's the Monteverde golden toad from Costa Rica, last seen in the 1980s. And it's when we see just the incredible beauty of what we're losing, to me, it's like watching a museum full of priceless works of art on fire. And it's something that we need to take action about. And so when you say, okay, well, let's take action, you know, conservation costs money. It costs money to save amphibians, just like it costs money to conserve birds or reptiles or mammals or fish. And when you look at amphibians from a conservation spending perspective, this is a graph of the amount of money being spent per species listed under the United States Endangered Species Act. And what you see is that for fish, you know, about the average amount of money spent on the average listed in fish under the Endangered Species Act is about $20 million. Yet the average amount of money spent on amphibians is about a third of the money spent on the average listed bird, reptile, or mammal. So amphibians are a neglected class. And a lot of people say, well, why are amphibians not getting equal attention? Why is there all of this discrepancy? And I think that there is just a much smaller constituency of people who really care about amphibians and advocate for them. You know, you'll see all of these different bird nonprofits, like the Audubon Society that has 800 full-time employees, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds that has 1,500 full-time employees, the BirdLife International has 2,000 full-time employees. Those are all people working full-time on conserving one class of vertebrates, but when you try and look at the equivalent of those groups for amphibians, they just aren't there.
Yeah, I have trouble thinking of a high-profile group that does that with frogs or salamanders. Not as widely known, at least.
No, it is a big problem, and even the big conservation nonprofits tend to focus on, if they do focus on a species, it'll be a charismatic mammal or a bird or a fish, and very seldom will it be an amphibian. So there's lots of threats to amphibians, and I could talk all day about those threats, but I'm not going to. I'm going to focus on the one threat that I'm particularly working on. And this is a map of Central America. And there's a fungus that has been spreading through Central America and has been associated with very rapid declines of amphibians as it spread. It started up here in the highlands of Mexico in the 1970s. and it's been associated with enigmatic declines of amphibians as it's spread through. So as you see all of these little dots here, they've been dots where we've seen amphibians suddenly vanish. And what we noticed is when it started coming through Panama, scientists really were on the lookout for what was happening, and they noticed that at some of these mountain sites, you would lose up to half of the species in 5 months when this fungus arrived. So what is it? You know, it's a kind of aquatic dispersed fungus that kills frogs and it eats their skin. This is a photograph of an endangered harlequin frog species from Panama, Atelopus lamosus, that I photographed in a stream in central Panama. And it shows the classic symptoms of Katerembomycosis. You'll see here that on its belly, which is normally this sort of color, it's very discolored there, and that's because the skin has been flaking and peeling off because of this fungus. And here we have some lesions where the skin is totally rubbed off. And what happens when this fungus infects the frog skin, it affects the frog's ability to osmoregulate and control its ion balance in its body. And so eventually it loses control completely of its bodily functions, and it has a heart attack and dies.
And what's the red that we're seeing on the image on it? It's not a color I'm used to seeing on a frog.
This red is actually a normal part of the coloration of this amphibian, but you can see the places where it's been rubbed off are actually the wounds, so to speak. The red on this image is not blood. So what are we doing about it? Well, we're doing 3 sorts of actions, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the research side, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleagues to tell you about the rescue and the outreach actions. So this is a photo of Matt Becker, and he's a PhD student at Virginia Tech who's been working with us at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute in Front Royal to see if we can find a cure for the chytrid fungus, so that would allow us to put these frogs back in the wild. Panamanian golden frogs are one species of very, very beautiful frog in Panama that is now has completely disappeared. And what we've been trying to do is try and grow protective bacteria that have been isolated from other frog skins and inoculate them onto the golden frog. And these bacteria produce antifungal chemicals that should give the frog a protective shield, so that when it becomes infected with chytrid fungus, that it kind of has its own pharmacy built into its skin, and it can protect itself from that fungus. So that's one of the lines of research that we've been exploring very rapidly. Another thing that we're doing is looking at methods of assisted reproduction. So if we, for example, have frogs in captivity that we are trying to breed because they're endangered and they might go extinct, but they're not breeding, we could have methods where we could give them particular hormone doses to get them into breeding condition and produce sexually reproductive material that we can use to either produce frogs on the spot, or we could take the gametes, like the sperm in this instance. Here's a photo of a frog sperm, and we could take those and perhaps freeze them and keep them for the future. One of the stories that I'm going to tell to illustrate the importance of this is black-footed ferrets from right here in the United States. Those animals went down to just 18 individuals. And fortunately, at the National Zoo, we were able to freeze some of the sperm from some of those individuals. So once the population was rebuilt into a much bigger, healthier population in the captive community, we then started looking back and seeing which parents and grandparents were still had their genes well represented in today's population, because you don't really want to be breeding brothers and sisters or cousins and cousins, because the chances that you'll get a genetic defect there are much higher than if you breed unrelated individuals. So what we found is that that gene pool had really shrunk because of that bottleneck of just 18 animals, and some of those founding 18 individuals were not well represented in the living collection today, and we were able to take some of the sperm from those animals and use artificial reproduction methods to rebuild the genetic integrity of that species. And so that's one of the forward-looking things that we're doing for our captive amphibian collection today. So what does a captive collection of frogs look like? This is inside a shipping container that used to be shipping strawberries and ice cream all around the world, but now is housing endangered amphibians. And we outfit them like this with lots of racks and tanks and try and keep some of the most endangered amphibians happy and healthy in captivity. And we do that by going out into the jungles of Panama and searching for some of the most endangered species that we think are at the highest risk of extinction from this disease, and bringing them back into captivity, where you're going to learn from Angie Estrada what it takes to save these frogs in captivity. And Angie is one of our leading amphibian conservation biologists from Panama, and she's a very talented biologist, and it takes a lot of work to keep these frogs alive and healthy and breeding. So I'm going to hand over to Angie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Angie, for joining us.
Estrada, and I work at the Panama Amphibian Rescue and Conservation Project with Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute here in Panama. And as Brian said, I'm going to tell you about what I do as a conservation biologist. I actually became interested in conservation of endangered species when I was in college as a biology major student in University of Panama. A group of friends used to volunteer at El Valle Amphibian Conservation Center, where a couple of biologists, Edgardo Griffith and Heidi Ross, were rescuing frogs from extinction by keeping them in 2 rooms in one of the hotels in El Valle, this community in central Panama. It was very shocking to me to find out that frogs and some species were just going to be gone. And since toads and frogs are not very good looking for many people, a lot of Panamanians and people in general didn't care that they were disappearing. And I decided to join the Amphibian Rescue Project in 2010, whose mission is to rescue amphibian species that are in extreme danger of extinction from an amphibian fungal disease, chytrid, what Brian told you about. Chytrid has been in Panama for over 15 years now, and we are focusing all our efforts on developing technology to control the disease, and ultimately our main goal is to put them back into the wild. As Brian showed you a picture of one of the containers, one of the shipping containers, we have 2 facilities here in Panama. We have El Valle Amphibian Conservation Center, where I used to volunteer, and the Gamboa Amphibian Rescue Center in the watershed of the canal. Both facilities house more than 20 species of frogs and toads, hundreds of individuals, and thousands of insects that we use as food. I have to admit, though, that sometimes it's very stressful and it's a huge responsibility to take care of such important little animals. But honestly, I have a really, really cool job. And it all starts with rescuing a frog this case, I'm showing you a picture of Atelopus certus. This is a male and a female. These are harlequin frogs from the highlands, forest in the Darien. It's very close to the Colombian border, and it's one of the species we have in one of our facilities. They have really bright colors, and they're very small. They have sexual dimorphism, which means that I can tell the difference. I can tell a male from a female using, and just by looking at them. So you can see the female is on your left, and she is bigger than the male. She is, well, orange and beautiful looking, and the male is a little bit smaller, and they normally tend to be, they tend to get darker sometimes, and yellowish, greenish colorations. Also, sometimes you can see the eggs through the female belly, and the male belly is completely white. So we have the frogs. We went to the field, and we brought them back to the lab, and now they're going to be in a glass tank, right? So the hard part of the job is asking these frogs to breed in captivity. And as much as I want them to breed, because my main goal is to put them back into the wild, I need to make sure the babies are going to survive in captivity. So they need to do some fun things. And so you can see again the male and the female. The male is on top, and they can lay their eggs. But for some of the pairs, it can take 2 or 3 days for them to lay the eggs. But for other ones, it takes up to 100 days for them to lay the eggs. And that's crazy. That's almost 3 months. And during that time, they won't do anything. The male won't even eat until the female is ready to lay the eggs. And it's not as simple as you might think. Like you think you'll put them in the tank and they get in this amplexus, which is this hog they spend a lot of time doing this hog until they're ready to breed. And trust me, it's not as simple as playing a romantic song from like a cutie guy. Sometimes you just don't want to do it, right? And we need to modify the tank and basically replicate nature in a small container. Since these frogs come from a highland forest, the environmental conditions in the lab need to match those conditions in the field. So we need to provide the same conditions, which are low temperature, high humidity, and good water quality. We also need to remember that these amphibians are mostly aquatic during their larval stage or when they're tadpoles. And they need very different conditions when they hatch and they become terrestrial frogs. In nature, this species breeds in streams, so we basically need to, again, replicate a stream or make a tiny river inside a 15-gallon tank. And for that, we need many things. So we have the tank. We need humidity and temperature and water. We have our main requirements. Check. As tadpoles, they need a lot of oxygen, so we need oxygen and a backup for oxygen. And then we need all kinds of really cool aquarium toys. We need rain chambers, a pump to create a current inside the tanks, misting system, fogging system, special lighting, plus all kinds of rocks and gravel, plants so they can climb, moss, and maybe after all of the things we need, I'll have a baby. After 8 to 10 days later, I'll have tadpoles, and those tadpoles would metamorphose in baby frogs. But there are 2 things that I forgot to tell you about these frogs. This species, Certus, the one I show you, can lay up to 1,200 eggs, and many of them will become frogs. So, for example, right now, we have 205 babies for one pair in the lab. I also forgot to tell you that these guys are tiny. Babies can be as small as 2 millimeters. Now imagining taking care of these guys, and sometimes I even have to use toothpick to move them around because they're so tiny. So they gotta have small hands. So these guys are gonna grow up. After 10 to 12 months, they're gonna be in their full adult size. And the most important thing they need is food. There's no way we could keep these frogs alive in captivity without insects. So we need to provide a variety of food because in the wild they eat many, many different species of insects. So we have to produce enough food for them to eat. So I think the two main items for them are this is the regular menu, are flies and insects. And they are relatively easy to produce in captivity. They just smell funny sometimes. And we have a lot of them. Then we also have all kinds of different insects like crickets and springtails, all kinds of worms, roaches. Yeah, those are yummy, huh? And grasshoppers. So yeah, we need to make sure these frogs are having a good time even though they're in captivity. So I told you that it's hard, but I also told you that it's a lot of fun, especially when we know we're saving frogs. And I have the pleasure to work with people that cares about frogs as much as I do. Some of them are a little too in love with them, but the other part of our job is sharing our love for frogs with people, with you guys. And we do that through outreach, and Sharon is going to be joining us, and she's going to tell you about how you can help and how you can be involved.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Sharon Ryan, and I work in science education and outreach here at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama. I guess I came to work for a research institute through somewhat of a different path. I started out working in communications in the private sector many years ago. Then about 12 years or so ago, I took a boat cruise around the Galapagos Islands. And I remember very vividly swimming with marine iguanas and seeing giant tortoises up close and also Darwin's finches everywhere, including, excuse me, on my lunch plate eating my rice because they're very cheeky. On board our cruise ship, we also had a naturalist guide from the Galapagos National Park, and so we heard a lot about the threats facing many of these unique animals in the islands and what the park and the research station were doing about it there. So overall, it really was an indelible experience for me, and it brought home the need to conserve these special places, not only through solid science and conservation practices that you've heard about this morning, but also through or by creating the kinds of educational experiences such as the one I had that engage and connect people to these causes. So a few months later, I returned home a few days later, and a few months later I packed my bags and I moved to the islands where I worked for the research station there for several years. And that's how I've come to be talking to you this morning about our Golden Frog Festival and some of the other outreach activities that we're doing in support of the amphibian rescue and conservation projects that are going on here in Panama. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat this morning. So in 2010, the government of Panama declared August 14th the National Panamanian Golden Frog Day in honor of this really unique species, which has had an important place in Panamanian culture for literally thousands of years. You can see through our slide here, for example, frogs have been a part of molas, or they're found in molas, which are, oh, excuse me, I'm going to get my pointer going. So frogs have been a part of molas, or elaborately embroidered clothworks of the Cunayala, which are the native people who live on small coral islands in the San Blas archipelago along the coasts of Panama and Colombia. You'll also find frogs in replicas of pre-Columbian artworks. This is a gold replica of a frog produced by a local factory here in Panama. There are also a variety of artworks and crafts, such as this frog made from tagua, which is a local hardwood seed here. I think it's from a palm tree, Angie tells me. And you'll also find frogs in a variety of trinkets, on beer labels. We have the golden frog beer in Panama, as well as tattoos. So we can see that, frogs are deeply embedded in the art, culture, and natural landscapes of Panama. And so this year we really wanted our Golden Frog Festival to reflect, the myriad ways that people connect to amphibians. And we wanted to do this by weaving art, science, and culture into our educational programming. We thought that this kind of programming would have appeal for a wide range of audiences. So I'll tell you a little bit about some of the different activities that we had this year. This right here, this this photo is from Punta Culebra Nature Center on our beach there, where we had a frog sand sculpture. We had lots of enthusiastic participants in that contest, including myself and my family, but unfortunately we did not win the contest. I'm not sure why. We also kicked off in midweek a series of science talks. This is Justin Touchon, who's one of our researchers here at the Institute, talking about amphibian research that's going on in Panama and how this research is contributing to an overall general body of science knowledge in many important ways. That was one of a series of talks at the auditorium. And so from the auditorium, we then took science down into the city. We visited a local pub called actually aptly named the Golden Frog Pub. And you'll see here in the middle of all this crowd is our illustrious Dr. Richard Cook, who's a renowned archaeologist here in Panama, and he's talking to this group of enthusiastic participants about the hallucinogenic properties of frog skins and how they were used in rituals and ceremonies by a variety of peoples throughout Panama's history. We also had, during that evening, a very captivating talk by our very own Angie, Estrada. And Angie's talk was called It's Not Easy Being Green. And also, it was so well received that that very night we had a number of volunteers sign up for the amphibian project here in Panama. So that was an exciting outcome. From Science in the City, we took it out to Science at the Zoo. This is the local Summit Zoo, one of our partners in the project. And this is a volunteer who's showing a visitor about, it's basically a frog restaurant. They've set up a frog restaurant to teach people about all the different kinds of bugs that frogs eat and the ways that frogs, by doing this, help keep the world from being overrun by bugs. So they perform a very important function. And you can see that kids were very interested in all the different kinds of bugs and the huge cockroaches and other scary creatures to me that were there that they were looking at. And this photo here, I guess, would illustrate what happens if you overindulge in some of the menus on the frog menu. And along with the science activities, we had a number of arts and crafts activities as well. And what I really love about this photo is that it shows that people of all ages love to do these kinds of things. We often think we're designing them for kids, but we're very much surprised at the wide range of people that love to take part. And that includes our local national police. You can see here we had a group of policemen who joined us during the day, policemen and policewomen, and they were very enthusiastic about the art activities. You can see a drawing of a strawberry poison dart frog, I believe, here by one of our participants. So we had a lot of fun at the zoo, and several hundred people came out for this event. So for these series events, so it was great. And of course, there's always frog face painting, which is a big hit always. In addition to some of the arts and crafts and science talks that we had, we also set up a number of exhibits in different sites. This is actually the permanent exhibit at the Amphibian Rescue Center, Conservation Center in El Valle. And one of our volunteers is talking to kids about some of the frogs that they can see here. And you can see they're very excited. Along with the exhibits, we also had school programs for about 1,000 school kids who came and learned about frogs and took part in a variety of science and art activities as well. And our week, one of the highlights of the week was a parade that took place in El Valle. We were really impressed with the creativity and the innovation that went into preparations for the costumes and for the overall parade. There were so many beautiful photos, it was really hard to pick from all the photos. But I have one here that's one of my personal favorites. This is a float of several of the local children dressed up as golden frogs, and they're participating in the parade. So so you can see from this picture here, a lot of people turn out for these events. There was great enthusiasm, and we were just so happy with the public engagement with this issue, but also around the project and the learning that took place and all the different opportunities that people had to engage with our scientists and our project coordinators and volunteers. So it was fabulous, and we were really pleased with the results. Here we just have a slight recap or general recap of the highlights for the week. We had over 6,000 visitors and participants in all the different sites, which was about double what we had last year. We also had, as I mentioned, about 1,000 kids participate in our field trips and school programming. And we had about 100 frog cookies eaten, and I must admit I was one of the people who ate a few of those. We were also lucky in that our events garnered a lot of publicity around the Golden Frog Festival, and we had spots on national TV and in the radio. Several of our scientists were interviewed, and overall we estimate that nearly 500,000 people either may have read, heard, or learned something about frogs and the issues that they're facing during this week. So we were really pleased with the results, and of course, none of that would have been possible without the tremendous support of all our volunteers and staff and scientists, as well as our collaborators. I can't mention them all here, but I'd like to sort of give a huge thanks to everybody for all their support. And before I finish up today, I wanted to give you a little sneak peek of a new program that's coming up. This will be our new exhibit called The Fabulous Frogs of Panama, and it's going to be opening early next year. 2014. For those of you who won't be able to participate or come visit us in person, we'll also be hosting a virtual tour and exhibit online, and so we'll keep you posted about those details. But it'll be exciting, and along with this, we'll have a great education program for the fabulous frogs of Panama. So I just wanted to say thank you very much this morning for taking the time to join us to learn about amphibians. They're fabulous creatures, and we really want them to live forever. And if you'd like more information, you can check out the website on the bottom. That'll also tell you some opportunities for volunteering, either here locally in Panama, but also all around the United States. There's lots of zoos that are working with us, lots of partners. So there are many different ways to get involved if you're interested. Thank you very much. And with this, we have a little video we'd like to finish up with, and then we'll turn it over to Adam. Thanks.
Wow, well, thank you, Sharon, for sharing so many really cool programs with us. They look like a lot of fun, and it looks like there's some interesting things that people can do with their own schools and their own classrooms. And I have to say, I'm craving a frog cookie now. So if that was also one of your goals, then you've sold me on it. We're right at the end of our time today, but it looks like we have a few more minutes to touch on some questions. And I did see one or two come in. And Brian, thank you for answering some of the questions in the chat as we were moving through. But we have one here from Paul Green wondering, have amphibians evolved or diversified more quickly than other species? I think maybe based on that map that we looked at with so many species scattered across the entire globe.
I think that's a very tough question to answer. It's basically a comparative rate of evolution question, because some frogs have originated fairly recently in evolutionary history, but others, like our own hellbender salamander, we think originated in the Jurassic period, but have remained pretty much unchanged since then. So I guess the answer is it depends on what species you're looking at, and there's a great diversity that you'll find in the frog world.
Oh, thank you. And earlier you were talking about how frogs are affected by what's going on in the water and what's going on the land. I'm guessing then with those high rates of endangerment and extinction, it's a good sign of how that environment is doing in that area. Are there any warnings or messages that humans that live in those areas can take from that?
Well, I think that frogs are an indicator of the health of an ecosystem in very general terms, and the fact that we are losing them for many different reasons is a sign that our own planet is becoming less habitable for frogs, certainly, and ultimately for us. So if we want to be good stewards of the planet, I think we need to conserve frogs. And I also wanted to take a note. I see a lot of you are participating from many different parts of the country, and this project is funded and was started by a lot of our great partners. The Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, the Houston Zoo, Zoo New England, and Defenders of Wildlife are all partners with the Smithsonian on this. So thank you very much to them, and if they're in your region of the world, you should go and look at their exhibits and mention the project to them.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. And a big thank you to Sharon and Angie as well. It sounds like there are a lot of ways to become active in helping to solve these problems all around the world. And it's great to have those resources available to us now. It looks like we are just about to wrap up, and I want to make sure to launch a quick evaluation link in the top left-hand corner of the screen for all of you. And if you can take a quick moment to click on that yellow evaluation button, we would love to get your feedback on today's session, especially as we prepare and plan for future sessions. And keep in mind that if you have any questions that weren't answered today, or you'd like to just continue the conversation after the session ends, feel free to go back to the forums on the website, visit our discussion forums, and tell us what you think and ask us what you're wondering. And we're happy to continue chatting with you there. But for today, I'll just say a big thank you to our presenters again. And Angie and Sharon, I don't know if you want to say a few last words as we sign off for today.
Okay.
Hi, yeah, this is Sharon. We just wanted to thank everybody for your interest and for joining us today online. It's really great that there's so much enthusiasm about frogs, and we hope you'll all get involved in some small way or other in your own communities in helping to save this amazing and wonderful species.
Great. Well, thank you again, everyone, and thank you to all of our participants for joining us. And we hope to see you at our upcoming Smithsonian online educational conferences. Thanks, everyone, and take care.